The Ottomans had the city surrounded. In moments, they would break through the walls and rain down terror on those behind them. After a nearly 2-month siege with some of the most bizarre, brilliant, and brutal military tactics in history, Constantinople's walls were about to crumble, and with them, the Byzantine Empire. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as a beacon of civilization, one of the most incredibly engineered cities in history, straddling 2 continents, a center of commerce and culture. But it was about to go through a major transition, and a lot of people would lose their lives in the process. Here are the creepy things that were normal in Constantinople. Breaking through.
Once more onto the breach, dear friends, is something that the Ottomans definitely didn't say.
But the line from Shakespeare was quite fitting for what was about to take place. It was May 29, 1453. The Ottoman forces had finally overwhelmed the Byzantines. The looting and chaos that ensued were brutal, as the Ottoman forces were unleashed upon the city. Soldiers plundered homes, palaces, and churches. They took all kinds of valuable treasures and jewelry. They targeted both private residences and public buildings, indiscriminately looting and destroying whatever they could find. The city's libraries and archives were ransacked, and invaluable historical and cultural artifacts were lost to history. The looting and chaos lasted for days as the Ottoman soldiers roamed the streets, inflicting terror and destruction. The once thriving and prosperous city was reduced to a scene of devastation and despair. Now, to be fair, the city wasn't doing so well before the walls were breached, but we'll get into that shortly. One historical first-hand account describes the scene in all its brutality.
Nothing will ever equal the horror of this harrowing and terrible spectacle. People frightened by the shouting ran out of their houses and were cut down by the sword before they knew what was happening. The enraged Turkish soldiers gave no quarter. When there was no longer any resistance, they were intent on pillage and roamed through the town stealing, disrobing, taking captive men, women, children, old men, young men, monks, priests, people of all sorts and conditions. Saints' altars, torn from their foundations, were overturned. All the most holy hiding places were violated and broken in order to get out the holy treasures which they contained.
Even the Hagia Sophia, the Grand Cathedral of Constantinople, wasn't spared from the rampage. Precious works of art and religious relics were stolen or destroyed, and the sacred space was desecrated. Mehmed II himself entered the Hagia Sophia and proclaimed it a mosque, which started the ball rolling for the conversion of the city's most iconic Christian symbol into an Islamic one. The Bashi-Bazouks. Once the walls were breached, the Byzantines had to deal with probably one of the craziest fighting forces in military history. Think Berserker Vikings, but with Turkish sabers. And their name just perfectly encapsulates the style in which they fought. The Bashi-Bazouks were irregular mercenary soldiers that helped out the Ottomans during the siege. They were notorious for their fierce and brutal fighting style, and were equally notorious for being more undisciplined and unpredictable than a child throwing a temper tantrum. Most of the Bashi-Bazouks were recruited from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. There were Turks, Kurds, and Balkan Muslims, among others, in their ranks. A lot of them often didn't agree about anything besides getting a paycheck. Most of them were out for personal gain and adventure. Some of them had been displaced from their homelands because of other wars. As a result of all of this, there really was no unified command structure. They were renegade mercenaries in the truest sense of the term. They were ruthless fighters, known to use hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla-style warfare, and surprise attacks and ambushes that would harass and demoralize whatever enemy they were getting paid to fight. They also operated largely outside of the formal military hierarchy of the Ottoman army, which often led to chaos. They basically went on looting and pillaging rampages after battles, indiscriminately targeting anyone who got in their way. And they were allowed to keep the loot that they stole during conquest, which just incentivized them to do more of it. The presence of the Bashi-Bazouks during the conquest of Constantinople just added to the chaos and violence of the siege. Their indiscriminate ways of warfare and looting basically tarnished the image of the Ottoman forces and contributed to the perception of the Ottomans as ruthless conquerors. It made Mehmed cry once he entered the city and saw the carnage they caused. Were they crocodile tears, though? Mehmed the Conqueror was the man in charge after all, and was the one who basically unleashed them on the city. Mehmed the Conqueror. But Mehmed II, the man behind the conquest, wasn't pleased with what had happened. He knew the history and beauty of the city and very much wanted to make it the crown jewel of the budding Ottoman Empire. According to the same source, when Mehmed saw the ravages, the destruction in the deserted houses, and all that had perished and become ruins, then a great sadness took possession of him, and he repented the pillage and all the destruction. Tears came to his eyes, and sobbing he expressed his sadness.
What a town this was, and we have allowed it to be destroyed.
Mehmed was only a fresh-faced sultan when he entered the Hagia Sophia for the first time. He was 21 years old. He'd ascended to the throne 2 years earlier and almost immediately set his sights on Constantinople. Well, not really. His father, Mehmed II, technically handed him the throne many years earlier when Mehmed was only 12. But then Murad decided he wanted to be king again, and he took the sultan hat back after just 2 years. Mehmed would have to wait another 5 years to become the sultan. For real this time. Let's rewind a bit and see how the upstart Ottomans grew to become the empire that would topple the Byzantines. They would start expanding beyond their Anatolian heartland in the early 14th century. Under the rule of their founder, Osman I, they gradually gobbled up territories in western Anatolia, including regions that were previously held by the Byzantines. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures, was scrambling to contain this new Ottoman threat. One of the crucial turning points came in the late 14th century with the conquest of the city of Gallipoli in 1354. It allowed the Ottomans to establish a foothold in Europe and capture the strategic Dardanelles Strait, which effectively cut off the Byzantine Empire from its western allies. Constantinople was isolated more than it ever had been and was ripe for the picking. Things kept going well for the Ottomans throughout the 15th century. They continued their westward expansion, capturing more key cities and territories. In 1396, they won a decisive victory over a Christian coalition in the Battle of Nicopolis. They were well on their way toward becoming one of the world's greatest empires. And then came Mehmed II. Mehmed really wanted Constantinople, but taking it would be no small challenge. It was the most well-fortified city in the world. One of his first projects in the lead-up to the siege was the construction of Rumeli Hisari in 1452, a fortress about halfway up the Bosphorus Strait that divides Europe and Asia. The strait was and still is a vital trade route that connects the Marmara Sea in the south to the Black Sea in the north, and building the fortress was Mehmed's way of flexing some muscle on the Bosphorus and telling the Byzantines that he and the Ottomans meant business.
As the Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, I stand at the helm of the Ottoman Empire, a force to be reckoned with, as resolute as the mighty fortress I have erected on the Bosphorus. Hear my words, O Byzantines, for they carry the weight of history and the determination of an empire that knows no bounds.
Rumeli Hisari was built, and it was built quickly. It was conceived of and finished in just 1 year, a massive feat of Ottoman engineering. Mehmed now had a major fortification along the Bosphorus. It was a great strategic location and had heavy-duty defensive features that allowed the Ottomans to effectively control the Bosphorus and prevent aid from reaching Constantinople from the north. The fortress became an essential staging ground for the Ottoman forces during the siege that would soon follow. Land ships. But Mehmed and the Ottomans had another problem. The Byzantines had a massive chain that stretched across what's known as the Golden Horn, an estuary off the Bosphorus that was calmer than the strait and would have been the ideal place to launch an invasion of the city from. There wasn't any chance the Ottomans could effectively surround Constantinople with that chain up, and it would be a mission they won't come back from to try and break through it. Mehmed the Conqueror needed to find a solution if he wanted to start conquering. What he came up with was one of the most brilliant military strategies in history. Well, it was brilliant because it worked. If it hadn't, it would have probably gone down as one of the dumbest military moves in history. Boats usually float, but in Mehmed's mind, they could roll too. The plan involved transporting his ships over land to surprise Byzantine forces and bypass that pesky chain. Mehmed and his commanders found a good route west of the Golden Horn, but it wasn't an easy one. The operation meant traversing very hilly terrain, including a pretty intense drop down into a valley and then back up. But in the end, it gave them a nice gradual descent into the Golden Horn, perfect for surprising the Byzantines. Once the route was mapped, they needed to build a ramp. A whole bunch of trees were cut down, and then the Ottomans greased them up so the ships could slide smoothly across them. And they needed a whole lot of manpower and oxen power. Some estimates put the number of soldiers and laborers involved in the effort at tens of thousands. A system of rope, levers, and wooden frames made sure everything went smoothly and the ships didn't crash down the hills. Oh, and they did all of this at night. It was a true guerrilla warfare style tactic, one that was executed to near perfection, despite the difficulty of literally dragging warships up and down hills in the middle of a forest. Try lugging a suitcase up a flight of stairs and then multiply that by, like, the population of modern-day Istanbul. When an estimated 70 Ottoman ships plopped down into the water behind Constantinople's defensive Golden Horn chain, they had the city surrounded. The siege was on. Greek fire. The Byzantine secret weapon has left historians scratching their heads for centuries. No one has really figured out the exact recipe, but it was basically napalm that they would fire through a hose. Nothing to mess with. And the Ottomans, the ones who survived anyway, would have nightmares about it for years to come. Legend has it that Greek fire was mixed up in the fiery depths of Mount Vesuvius by an alchemist with a penchant for pyrotechnics. Not really. The Byzantines developed the stuff sometime in the 7th century, a time when dragons were apparently in short supply and wizards were looked down upon as unchristian heretics. The Byzantine secret weapon was a closely guarded recipe handed down from one emperor to the next like the ingredients in your grandma's casserole. The liquid mixture could set the sea on fire and turn enemy ships into floating torches. During the siege, the Byzantines unleashed Greek fire on the Ottomans with devastating effect. Siphons and flamethrowers, the medieval equivalent of high-pressure hoses, spat out streams of the fiery liquid from Byzantine ships onto Ottoman ships as their fleet tried to approach the city. The Ottomans were not prepared for such a blistering reception, and there was a whole lot of panic and chaos as the air filled with the smell of burnt wood, singed hair, and broken dreams. The psychological impact of Greek fire is something to consider too. A huge chunk of the Ottoman fleet was up in flames, and throwing water on the fire did absolutely nothing. But for all its awe-inspiring spectacle, Greek fire did have its limitations. Its range was disproportionately limited, and if the weather conditions weren't great, the stuff was hard to use effectively. So, despite the mysterious napalm tech, the Ottomans persevered and made it to the walls. But that was a whole other challenge that needed to be overcome. And once again, Mehmed had a solution. And the solution came in the form of some of the largest cannons ever created. Byzantine walls versus Ottoman cannons. There have been a lot of good walls throughout history. There was the great one in China, the Incan one in Cusco that looks like something a kid would build in a Disney World type playground. The Berlin one wasn't a great time in history, but it was still, unfortunately, a pretty effective wall. And the walls of Constantinople were probably the most impressive city fortifications in ancient and medieval history. Let's go on a little journey through the history and layout of Constantinople's walls. Let's call it a little wall nerd out. Doing so will definitely give us a new appreciation for the literal tall task that Mehmed and the Ottomans were up against as they were trying to capture the city. Picture this. It's the 4th century AD. Emperor Constantine the Great, the Constantine after which Constantinople was named, is on a mission to establish a new capital that will rival the glory of Rome. A glorious city needed glorious walls back then, and so he built some.
Today, we stand at the precipice of a new era, a chapter destined to be etched in the annals of history. As your emperor, it is my solemn duty to guide this great empire towards new horizons, to pave the way for a future that shall surpass even the grandeur of Rome itself. Behold, the birth of a new capital, a city that shall be a testament to the indomitable spirit and unwavering ambition of our people. Constantinople, named in honor of my humble self, shall rise from the very heart of our empire, reaching towards the heavens and radiating with the splendor of Rome's glorious past.
But Constantinople keeps growing, and soon the city has grown too big for its own walls. Kind of like buying baby clothes. That little human won't be able to wear them for very long. Fast forward to the 5th century. Emperor Theodosius II is in charge now. He loves walls even more than Constantine, and he proves his love for them by building some of the most impressive fortifications that the world has ever known. The Theodosian walls were basically a masterpiece of engineering and wartime paranoia, made up of a few pretty impressive elements. At their core stood the imposing inner wall, towering to a height of around 40 feet. It was made of stone, but with concrete at its center. This wall alone would have been enough to deter an entire army. But wait, there's more. Just outside the inner wall, Theodosius built a smaller outer wall. Together, they created a formidable double-layered defense that probably intimidated the pants off a lot of would-be seizures. besieger even a word? How about besieger? Does anyone have a dictionary? But wait, there's even more. We can't forget the lower wall and moat system. This third layer consisted of a deep moat bookended with two smaller walls and filled with water and Roman alligators wearing legionnaire helmets. I think historians often forget that fact. What's a good moat without alligators anyway? And then there were the towers spaced out at different points along the wall. You had the Tower of Eugenius, the Tower of Galatius, and the Tower of Isaac, to name a few. From these points, the Byzantines could keep watch over their city and rain down death and destruction if any armies wanted to try their luck at getting in. Constantinople did fall briefly during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, but there was not a significant amount of betrayal and backstabbing involved in that one, which we can save for another video. I do hope that now you have a greater appreciation for a good wall, but don't take it too far like this woman who married the Berlin Wall. How does that exactly work? So to get through the Theodosian walls, the Ottomans needed to have some pretty heavy firepower. And like we said before, they found it in the form of some of the most massive cannons ever built in ancient and medieval times. Now, they weren't nuclear missiles, but for the period, they were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. And they were designed by a Hungarian named Orban. No, not him. Him. Oh, wait. Seems like there are not any images of him. Oh well, here's his cannon. The basilic cannon, as it was called, was a behemoth. It was 27 feet long, 2.5 feet in diameter, and could fire a 1,200-pound cannonball over a mile. To build the thing, Mehmed hired the aforementioned Orban, or Urban as he sometimes goes by. Orban was a renowned engineer and had actually offered to help out Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI build a massive weapon. But Orban was apparently so good that not even the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire could afford his services. It's kind of a telling sign when you think about it. The Byzantines were already in loads of trouble politically and financially. So instead, Mehmed hired him. Mehmed knew that he needed a great weapon to get through those walls. And Orban outlined a design that probably made the Ottoman Sultan's mouth water. Now, the construction of the cannon needed to be exact. If there was a flaw here or a flaw there, the whole thing would literally blow up in the Ottomans' faces. Orban was good, though, and the cannon was built. Now, records suggest it was probably built in Edirne, to the west of Constantinople near modern-day Bulgaria, where Mehmed was born. Once it was built, they had to transport the thing, which was a whole other logistical nightmare. They did it, though, and brought it up to the walls along with other artillery pieces and siege engines that were strategically positioned to create a concentrated barrage on specific sections of the city's walls. The coordinated assault wreaked havoc on Constantinople's fortifications. The final charge for Constantinople was imminent. Bad Byzantines. The Byzantines were by no means innocent bystanders, though. In the centuries leading up to the final fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was what can only be described as a mess. The empire had been in decline for a few hundred years. It had been besieged a bunch of times, invaded, surrounded, and just generally beaten down in a lot of ways. But a lot of it was self-inflicted. One of the things that just exacerbated the disarray of the Byzantine Empire was its crazy policies towards its own citizens. There was a highly centralized government in place that put ultimate power in the hands of the emperor. One of the most crucial policies of the Byzantine Empire was its use of the so-called mutilation penalty. It was a punishment that involved removing a person's nose or ears, or even blinding them for crimes like treason or rebellion. The mutilation penalty was intended to be a deterrent, but it was also used as a way to suppress dissent and intimidate people. The Byzantine Empire also had a highly stratified social structure. The aristocracy had most of the wealth, while everyone else was basically forced to eat dirt. Peasants worked long hours for little pay. Resentment was building. The empire also struggled with economic instability in the centuries leading up to the fall of Constantinople. Remember how Constantine XI couldn't even afford the services of cannon builder extraordinaire Orban? The empire had a corrupt, nasty, highly centralized economy. Sick Byzantines. And then there was the coughing and fever. The Black Death wreaked havoc on the population of Constantinople in the years leading up to its conquest by the Ottomans. It had its origins in Asia and spread through trade routes and reached Constantinople in the mid-14th century. It was a horror show. It caused widespread devastation and led to a crazy decline in the population. The exact numbers are hard to pinpoint, but let's put it this way. Around 1200, the population of the city was somewhere around 500,000, leading to the Ottomans breaking through the walls. The population was around 50,000. There are other factors involved in those numbers, But it's pretty telling, nonetheless. The plague ravaged Constantinople in multiple ways, each one causing more suffering and loss of life. The disease spread rapidly, fueled by crowded living conditions, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge to combat it very well. Constantinople was one of the world's busiest cities and major trading hubs, and because of this, its population was particularly vulnerable. The impact of the plague on the population was catastrophic. Death tolls soared, and the city's infrastructure struggled to cope with the overwhelming number of bodies. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the deceased, and the stench of death wafted through the air. The loss of life resulted in significant decline in the workforce, which led to more economic disruption and yet more social upheaval. The plague also had a big psychological effect on those who survived. Fear and desperation gripped the city as people witnessed the suffering and demise of their loved ones. The constant threat of infection hung over the survivors, further exacerbating their distress and weakening their ability to resist external threats. Collapse was almost inevitable. Aftermath. With Constantinople firmly in Ottoman hands, Mehmed II started cleaning houses. He implemented a series of measures to consolidate his rule and suppress any potential threats within the former Byzantine territories. One of the first targets of Mehmed's crackdown was the Byzantine nobility. In order to secure his authority and prevent any potential rebellions, he took harsh measures against the Byzantine aristocracy. Many prominent nobles and officials lost their lives or were imprisoned, and their properties and estates were confiscated. Mehmed's goal, like a lot of new conquerors, was to dismantle the existing power structures of the Byzantine Empire and replace them with his own guys. He then set his sights elsewhere and started, well, conquering. He was Mehmed the Conqueror after all. He went into Serbia, took out its leader, and annexed most of it and put it under Ottoman governance. He even invaded Albania and took significant chunks of that kingdom. The man went into Bosnia and forced their nobility to submit to Ottoman rule. He went deeper into Anatolia and conquered more of that. He was a conqueror, and his nickname is pretty fitting. The Ottoman Empire was on the rise. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, and the Ottoman sultans would rule for the next 450 years. What would you do if you were trapped inside a besieged city? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history.